Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joanne Conti, and I'm the principal of Benjamin Franklin Elementary School in Meriden. And I'm also a member of the CAS Education Equity Committee. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our afternoon breakout session, Critical Race Theory, the Concept and the Controversy Surrounding it. This topic is critically important as we dive more deeply and explore how we can work together to learn and lead for systemic racial and social justice. Thank you so much for attending in this session and joining us today. I want to begin by recognizing and thanking our education partners, the Connecticut Department of Education and SERC, for their generous support in helping us to make this Education Equity Summit possible. And now, just a few quick reminders. Everyone has been muted. If possible, please turn your video on, as it's nice to be able to see everyone. And please ask questions in the chat or raise your hand with the button at the bottom of the screen to be recognized by the presenters if you would like to speak. We will do our best to answer your questions during this webinar. Along with asking questions in the chat, please use the chat to share ideas and let us know if you experience technical problems during the Zoom meeting, as we will be monitoring the chat. And this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the CAS website. You will receive a notification email as soon as all of the sessions from today are available. Please feel free to view this session and the rest of the sessions at your leisure and share them with your colleagues and friends. Our hope is that you will find this useful for professional learning within your school community during this coming school year. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our presenters for this session to you. Stephen Proffitt is the Director for Special Education Programs and Instructional Design at SERC, and Nilda Diaz is an education consultant also at SERC. Hopefully you had a chance to participate with them during the self-reflection activity this morning during our general session. So please join me in welcoming Steve and Nilda.
Thank you, everyone. It's so great having you here. I dropped in the chat box the Critical Race Theory. It's a special edition of articles from Education Week that you can reference after this conversation. We will be referencing only the first article from Stephen Sawchuk, who's the assistant editor of Education Week. But it just, you know, at the State Education Resource Center, our mission and vision is around equity, excellence, and education. So Nilda and I would like to engage just in a conversation with you about, you know, this article and a video that we're going to share with you about what is critical race theory and why is there controversy around it. And so what we'll do is share that. Nilda, do you want to say a few words before we move on?
Sure. So my name is Nilda. I am a consultant at SERC, and thank you for being here. I know we don't get to see your beautiful faces, but if you decide to show us your beautiful faces, know that we are willing to have you turn on your camera. And before, while Steve sets that up, can we get on people in the chat just to tell us from 1 to 5 what their knowledge level is, what they feel their knowledge level is with CRT, with the critical race theory framework. 1 being like, I really know nothing about it. And 5 is like, I'm an expert, I can teach and apply it to policies and practices and think about it and how does that work in education. Okay, I see a 2, 3.5, maybe a 3.
Oh. 3.5.
Anyone else? So we got 3s and 2s, maybe a 3, 3.5. Brian said 3.5. Dr. Frank.
Yep.
All right. Go ahead, Steve.
Good. So just as we begin to engage in this conversation and we view this video, just some agreements that we tend to use at SERC when we're talking about race and we talk about conversations around disability, the intersection of race with disability, the intersection of race with other subgroups. We just want to engage in discussion from a place of honesty and true values, just to acknowledge and be open to multiple perspectives in this space, and just to listen mindfully and be present with an appropriate time for reflection and response. Those are some of the typical agreements we tend to use when we engage in some of these courageous conversations. Okay, so let me share this video. And this is the actual video that's embedded in that article that I shared in the chat box. So let's see if this works. Here it is. Okay, it should go.
Educators are facing questions about critical race theory, but what is it and why is it under attack? Critical race theory is an academic and legal concept that's been around for 4 decades. The core idea is that racism isn't just about individual prejudice or bias, it's woven into public policies and laws, even those that seem to be race blind. Single-family zoning, for example, makes it harder to build affordable housing and further desegregation efforts. In K-12 education, people have applied these concepts to patterns of student discipline and tracking systems. Because racism is part of this context of everyday life, people, white or non-white, who don't intend to be racist can nevertheless make choices that fuel racism, the theory says. It's important to note that critical race theory isn't a program or a training or a curriculum. It's a way of thinking about the world. Still, it's controversial because critics, largely though not exclusively conservatives, allege that this way of thinking fuels division or pits people of color against white people. Lawmakers in more than a dozen states have already passed or are debating legislation to ban the use of critical race theory or divisive topics in the classroom. Sometimes critical race theory is conflated with anti-racism and social justice, which are more common terms and concepts used and taught in schools. This might mean that parents or school board members could use the term critical race theory to challenge curriculum and lessons. Proposals to ban critical race theory could have a chilling effect on what teachers teach about certain topics. They might worry that teaching the full history of the removal of Indigenous peoples, or the Civil War, or the Tulsa race massacre will land them in trouble with parents or administrators. While some district officials have issued mission statements or resolutions, or they've spoken about changes in their policies using some of the discourse of critical race theory, it's actually not clear to what extent educators are explicitly teaching these concepts, or even using curriculum materials or other methods that implicitly draw on them. This is a really complex topic, so we encourage you to look at Education Week's resources at edweek.org/race to learn more.
Were you able to see the video? Okay, good. All right. So at the end of that video are the resources as he shared. Okay, so we set up a series of questions that we wanted to share with you. Nilda, did you want to kind of lead us off with some of our guiding questions?
Yep, go ahead. Okay, can you guys see the, because I'm looking, all right. So I know that most of you wrote 3s and 2s, right? But from what you wrote, what you saw in the video, that little bit, that understanding that critical race theory is not a class, it's not something that we teach like that, right? And it's actually, as you know, if you've been reading, taught in grad school, mostly, right? And it comes from critical legal stories, and it is not, yeah, actually also there's a couple of papers out on Marxism and how they oppose critical race theory because it doesn't, according to them, address class. But so is none of those things from what you saw. How could you help teachers and students and families understand what this abstract concept or framework is all about. And you could share out loud, or you could put it in the chat. How do you do that? How could you? I mean, actually, there's no right or wrong answer. I don't think, you know, we don't want you to think like there has to be a right way to do this. No. What do you think, anybody? I mean, we don't have a big group, so I can call on people's names.
But even just making some of the connections from this morning, from our presenters and our speakers, just how to, you know, are you able to really begin to engage in these conversations and around to help support your staff and your families and students around understanding really what critical race theory is. This is a safe space, everyone.
Hello, all.
Hi, Brian.
Hello. I won't lie, as a social studies teacher, I have no idea how to answer this question, particularly because the answer involves a level of nuance that a lot of the critics, the outspoken voices that we hear about critical race theory are not willing to you know, lend their minds to. So I really struggle with this question.
Okay, that's fair. And it is a lot of nuances, right? Because that's why it's so like cautionary note. We have to read a lot of more stuff, not only the EdWeek and the video, because it's bigger than that, right? And we don't want to just simplify it. And then the people who are making a lot of noise just heard 2 words and now create this myth that is not really true. So we have to be able to have that counter story, like, which is part of critical race theory framework, the tenet, in order for us to help our families understand what the framework is and how does that work to ensure that there are a lot of, you know, equitable access in education for our students. So how would you, go ahead, Steve.
I think you have to combine it with sort of the culturally responsive teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, it's like the gentleman said this morning, just do it. Get some curricular reform in there with a different with a broader view of what's going on. And you know, it's just because it's not you don't teach critical race theory. You know, it's a way of thinking, and that way of thinking should be reflected in curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, this is such a complex process, Brian, you know, and Tim, and just, you know, so I think that the more we read, the more we understand, including myself. I mean, I learn something new every day. I learned so much from this morning, you know, it's just continually building my own knowledge and how to, you know, transfer some of that to our students, our families, our educators.
Mm-hmm.
Nicole, do you want to go over some of the tenets in our last session? Nita did a great
Nicole,
job.
like, hello, Steve, Nita. Do you know that Steve calls me Nicole all the time? That's like a running joke between
I know
me
Nicole.
and I. Like, honestly, like, honestly, that's true. Like, I'm like, Steve. It doesn't bother me.
In our last session, we had a number of our participants wanted just to kind of see an overview of what the critical tenets of critical race theory are. So Anita did a really good, you know, helicopter view of what those tenets were. So why don't you just go over those, and then we it engages us in some pretty rich conversation.
So I'm just going to go over them really fast, right? And you know that the framework, the theory comes from legal studies and a lot of other stuff around intersectionality. What we call is like interdisciplinary. We know, and I didn't say this before, we know there's Latino critical race studies theory, Asian, Native American, so you could Google them and find them, right? And this theory evolved from that piece of critical legal studies as a response to the way that traditional piece of civil rights, which you will see in one of the tenets movement, how that was happening in the USA, meaning it was slowly, there was an incremental change. Things were moving, but not as fast, right? It was like just growth, what we still see in somehow. And but critical race theory framework said we have to look at the bigger picture, the broader picture, right? And so what the framework does is talks about social inequalities. Why, it's kind of like asking, why is it that we create all these policies and programs and strategies and intervention, but our kids are still not doing very well? So we have well-intentions, outcomes are not coming out the way we expected, right? So critical race theory not only looks at that individual, looks at the many different factors that can't hinder policy and access to opportunities, right? So it recognizes that race and racism work through different aspects, that's the intersectionality through gender, ethnicity, class, and other systems of power, right? It says, you might have great intentions, Nita, but if you don't have any type of power, nothing's gonna change. And, the tenets is like those principles, and the principles, and the one that you see a lot is that, are you calling people like white people racist? No, we're not saying that. So there's a permanence of racism down there, right? So what is that critique of liberalism? That tenet says there's a notion and belief of this color blindness, right? That I don't see color, that the law is neutral, which we know is not what we see, right? This is just ideals, like color blindness. I don't see color except when I ask you, and this is just like a joke I say to my kid. All right, so you don't see color, but when I ask you to point out what the person who stole your purse looks like, you suddenly see color. So the incremental change is that growth piece, right? Change is happening, but it's slow. So the liberalism, they critique this because they say, like, how do you not see color? It's okay to see color. Like, why do you say that law is neutral? We know the law is not neutral. And we have seen it in many, many different aspects, right? And why change is still so slow. So the second one is counter storytelling. And this is, this is kind of like student voice, like I said this morning. So it's a way of having the stories of other voices that are not usually at the table in next to the dominant ideology, talking about, let me tell you my story. Let me tell you what it's like to be Puerto Rican. And let's talk about the policy around English learners or students with disabilities or African-American students or Latinos that is hindering me and why that doesn't work. So counter story, this tenet says, we want to make those voices valid. So when you look, it's very interesting. Sometimes, in working in the curriculum, I would look at, for the Latino Puerto Rican side, I would look at a text written by a Puerto Rican Latino author and the same history from a different perspective. And there were differences, right? So who is telling the story? So in the tenets, they say, we have to ensure that there is validity with everybody, with those voices, that they're not out of the table. So if you want students who are learning English to tell you what they need, then we need to ask them. We cannot assume because somebody in Utah decided that that's the way it should work. So whiteness as property is when we look at whiteness, not white people, whiteness in the sense of a term, right? And historically in the USA, people were defined as being enslaved or being free. The US history says they are rights that have the right to possess, the right to use, and the right to dispossess. So it's that entitlement that I believe I had. Based, remember, we're talking intersectionality, based on different things, right? So if I have white privilege based on my skin color, but also have class privilege because of my social class, social status, then I believe that I have some rights that other people don't have. And so think about that as a leader. What does that look like in our schools when we, if this tenet we don't know about and we're creating policies and practices or making schedules and decisions when we feel that we are entitled. So we see this a lot, for example, if you think about funding. So a parent from a urban district says that where mostly white students attend based on the city. So you're taking funding from my school to send it to Nitsa's school because they need it more. I don't think that's fair. So it's that right that I have to use to possess and dispossess. So that's what this tenet tells you, that historically the USA, if you even think about the founding fathers, like if you watch Hamilton or read Hamilton, right, that's the easiest one to remember. Some of the history behind of why those decisions were made were related to social class and race and color of the skin. So they needed money because they owed money. So they inserted this tax to the people who helped them fight, right? So because the people who were in power, whiteness as property, felt entitled to possess the lower classes. And last but not least, and the other one that we'll talk about is interest convergence. It's like, I give you something, you give me something else. So I believe that if I give something, so if we create a law that's going to help students of color, I'm going to also ensure, I'm going to do it because I know it's going to help this other group as well. So there's an interest in creating a policy that's going to help the majority, if they are the majority, the group that seems to be in power, the institution, that system that created that power. It's really not because they want everybody to get ahead, it's because what is in it for me? Am I also benefiting for that? I used the example before of when Puerto Ricans became citizens in 1917. What was happening in the US in 1917? Do you guys remember? All right, Brian, what's the answer? Ding, 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 ding.
Well, the end, either the end of World War I or the Spanish flu.
World War I, yeah. So they didn't have enough, like look at that Spanish flu, World War I, and now that we have this, we invaded this little island and they had people, and I think we should make them citizens. Who benefited? That's interest convergence. Is it a bad thing according to the rest of the world that I carry an American passport? No, I'm not gonna say here and say to you, oh, it's a bad thing that I'm a US citizen. So this is what that tenet says, like that we sometimes don't do things for the benefits, like, you know, of other. We do it also because I'm gonna get something that benefits me as well. And the permanence of racism, this is the one that you see a lot on the news, like, oh, are you calling me racist? But what it's saying is that the systems created in the USA, how we govern, how we do things, our economic and political and social, they all are based on the concept of race as a construct. So race is something made up. So if I create a system that says this skin color is going to be at the top and this skin color is going to be at the bottom, then I'm going to create a structure that ensures that. And that's what we see in schools sometimes, right? Somebody mentioned in the state of Connecticut, you see this because where people live is segregated, which then in turn happens to have a lot of schools that are segregated. So that racism as that construct that was made up created policies and social domains and things in order for me to have access that suggest a hierarchy. I don't think people, this is just me, I don't know that people sat down and said, well, Steve, I don't think Steve sat down and said, I'm going to create that because I want to stay in power. I don't think so. Maybe someday there are some people who choose to do that, but it's almost, that is why that binary that race and racism in the USA, in the history, in the structures is so permanent because we create things like that. So I said in the other group, I was at a district at a school and they were showing me the policy handbook and the discipline policy was the only one in Spanish. How convenient. What is that about?
Okay, so Nilda shared these tenets, and in the chat box, I dropped that it's a most recent article, a lesson on critical race theory that blends the CLS, the critical legal system, and the CRT framework.
Mm-hmm.
But just now, with this understanding, and as you take this information and continue to build your knowledge and share some of this information with your staff, how will you do that? What do you envision to help break down some of these barriers in order to create much greater equitable opportunities for each and every student that we serve? And or just using some of the information you learned this morning. What are your thoughts on embracing this content, on embracing this work?
Steve, I think it starts with what we were talking about before, right? That it starts with me and you, right? My own belief system and what do I believe about certain things and certain policies and how do I see the system working, right? It starts with when, my belief of that if I don't speak English, then I'm not smart enough, or Nilda is a risk because she just came and she doesn't speak English, right? So therefore all English learners are at risk, I don't know for what. Or how about kids who are learning another language, or based also, or students of color should have the same opportunity. What do I believe, right? I'm very intentional in my thinking about those things.
Mm-hmm.
Because that why I believe that is going to translate into how and why and how I do this and those actions. Sometimes when we think about policies and we say, okay, I'm going to create a policy, the beauty of CRT is that you have the opportunity to now ask the students, what would you like that policy to be? Or why do we need it?
Mm-hmm. Any other comments from some of Nilda's thoughts? Okay, Mrs. Hardy.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon.
Good morning, good afternoon, yes.
Nilda, you hit it right. You hit the head right on the nail because, first you have to ask yourself, where am I at right now with my beliefs and my values and my core system? And then you have to step back and you have to realize that not everybody has the same ones, obviously. So you need to look at within your school, within your family, within your social circle, and everything that's surrounding that has made you get to where you are now, so that you can take those and you can start to understand and really, I don't want to say become familiar with, but yeah, become familiar with other people's perspectives in life. And with CRT, it helps you to put things into perspective of not just your own culture and your own beliefs, but really take into account what's going on around you and not just within your own little bubble.
Yep, completely correct. I see two people who rose their hand, but I don't see their names, Steve.
We have
Oh,
Brian.
Yes, I agree with both of those points, and I think to mitigate some of the the disagreement that might come from staff, it's important to reassess the school norms and values and make sure that when we say all students, we mean all students, and therefore we really need to take a look at at some of our policies from a larger basis, make sure all students are having an equitable opportunity.
Ms. Hardy and Brian, great points.
I think there was another hand up, but I don't see it now.
how can CRT, help us promote anti-racism and equity in our schools? But like when we open this new school year, which is going to be, when you think about reimagining a new year, how are we going to promote, looking at all the work that we do from an equity lens?
I'm just going to jump in here if that's okay.
Sure.
That's a hard question for me personally to answer because I just started at the school I'm at now as an assistant principal in March. And I walked into a situation where there was already an uproar of needing to find a way to promote anti-racism and anti-bias within our school. So we've actually recently contracted with SERC to work over the next year to two with a couple of your representatives within our school to help us build a steering committee to go about that. So while we as a school are still constructing how we're going to implement all these techniques and all these ideas into our school, I know with me personally, I'm taking experiences. I have a very diverse, transgender students. I have culturally different students. I have a lot of different students within the classrooms that I manage that I need to work with my teachers personally to make sure that they are aware and basically willing to open up to understand how they're going to teach a curriculum that's going to be, equal to all of our students or to get to all of our students. So all of our students not only have IEPs, but they're also, like I said, diverse. So we have a large culture of different things that we have to do in order to successfully get to all of our students in a way that will help them to move forward. And my teachers, first thing they need to do, and the staff that I work with need to open up themselves to start to understand and really get familiar with the students in their classrooms and their diversities.
True.
Great points. And I'm going to, I'm sure many of you have already seen the release, it happened in May, the CT Accelerate framework. And it really helps you to understand and prioritize all of our students. As Brian said, we have to ensure that all students are created and provided with equitable opportunities. And we know that during this pandemic, it even elevated some of the disparities even to a much higher level. Our students with disabilities, our different races and cultures, our multilingual learners, our students of color. And how do we begin to engage our educators and our families to really begin to have these conversations to ensure equitable opportunities are provided for all. Knowing that many of our students have missed opportunities in learning last year.
And I think that that's an important point to remember. But even if we have all these things, but our teachers and our staff are not thinking about themselves and what my beliefs are. Do I truly believe that they're able to do X, Y, and Z? And if I don't, then what do I do, right? There are different responses to that personally I would give, but that's besides the point. But I think about that a lot because even if I don't believe in X, Y, and Z, am I still able to be a teacher for all students? Do I really believe that everyone can learn? And how do I then have that transformation if that's what's needed, right? Like my cousin who's a psychiatrist once told me, and I never forget this because of my kid, he said, Prima, is the behavior your child is doing, is it that is bothering you personally, or is it unsafe? Because if you tell me that it's bothering you, but he or is safe, then you know what? Go away. Simple. I was like, yeah, like, hello. But think about it, right? When we create the policy, do we create the policy because do I believe that all students with IEPs or all students of color, or do I believe that everyone should have the chance of taking AP with the content and teaching it in a way that makes sense for all students without watering down, if I truly want to see results? Because sometimes, we say, okay, this is the framework, and they will say, like, Steve goes there and says, let's use the Accelerate framework, and we think it's great. But if I don't believe it, then what I'm doing is trying to figure out a way to show Steve, you're wrong. They don't know how to do it. Look, I tried all of that and they didn't make progress. It has nothing to do with Steve and the framework. It had to do with that piece of critical race theory framework of my beliefs and understanding that there's, counter storytelling and interest convergence. I'm just doing this because Steve is making me, and that's just going to give one kid access, so great. But I just need Steve not to bother me anymore.
Mhm.
So how do I do that as a leader? How do we make it better for all of our students?
Itza, can you hear me?
Sí, señora.
Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. That's a very interesting question that you posed. And I think that for me is your willingness or not to do the work, your own work. Because unless you come into contact with your own biases, because we don't live in a vacuum. We're born and raised, and I'm from the school of thought from UMass Amherst, and we talked a lot about when the social justice movement was just about taking shape in this country. And in Connecticut, we talked a lot about the theory of oppression and how these lenses that you were born with are clear. But as you get older, based on the messages and based on your environment and your institutions, they start to get tinted. So the challenge for me is, do you want to take those lenses off and actually really do the work? Because we're biased. We're not born and raised, and we don't work in isolation in a bubble. That's totally, it doesn't happen any place in the world. And I'm a scientist by trade. I'm a chemist and a mathematician. So the concept of absolute value doesn't exist in human nature, because no matter what you bring to the table, you're going to have an opinion that has been shaped by your experiences, by your learnings, by your questioning. So I'm bringing it to a very elemental, very, very, very basic level, outside of all the theories and equity and equality and diversity and all the terminology that we had grown to work with and live with. Is, do you really want to do the work? And that's painful and that's scary. Do you really want to say? Because I'll tell you one thing. I know for a fact, when I was teaching in the NEAC School of Education, in the grad program, teaching future teachers, I know for a fact that you're not going to be, if you're a male teacher, chances are you're going to be much better for your male students. If you're a female teacher, you're going to be much better off for your female students. And you're aware, but it's in you, it's in your DNA. So unless we create a space in which we're willing to talk about and having and engage into courageous conversations about our own biases and how can we overcome those and recognize them, then we find ourselves, when I joined the agency 30 years ago, in the midst of Chef Bionil, in which we're beginning to talk about gender equity and diversity and everything that, we had engaged here today. It's a conversation that has been ongoing. And I'm so happy and glad that as I, look at the end of the tunnel for me in terms of my professional career, that there's many more people, many more warriors that are willing to stand. But the challenge that I pose to all of you is, are you willing to look at yourself, to look at your bias, to recognize your bias, and grow? So you can be better for kids before you, in that classroom, in that cafeteria, in that gym, in that parking lot, in whichever space you are associated with students.
Thank you, Agnes.
Thank you, Agnes.
Welcome.
So I think a lot of what we got at the why, we've got to really, if we're going to, for all students, we have to really dig deep around our beliefs that we can and want to teach all students. The next question is getting at, as we begin to is the how. How are we going to do that? How are we going to change our actions and look at our actions to break down some of the barriers that are disrupting equitable opportunities for all students?
And I think that's hard sometimes, right? Because once we figure out and then we go, okay, I thought I had it all figured out and then now it's not working. Like it doesn't feel good as humans, like, because we thought we were done, we did it. And then now it's not working for a group of kids. Then now how do we change that? What do the actions look like if it's not working? Or what do I do when the students point out to me and say, well, that don't work for me. I think like that's not what I want. That's not what I need. And we think we had it all figured out. Is the outcomes we think are going to be the best, and they're like, no. What do we do? So
and
that's that. Go ahead.
Are there any other comments? Insight?
You have to keep trying. You know what I'm saying? You got to provide whatever supports are out there. You just got to keep trying. Think outside the box, be creative, borrow, talk to other people. We don't, again, we don't live in isolation. We live in a world that is quite complex, but there are always questions to be asked. I had the privilege of working with bilingual international schools abroad, and there's always a way. They figured out a way. So I try to bring those ideas back to to my workspace and to share with my colleagues. There's always a way, always. We just don't give ourselves enough credit to the level of creativity. And I think I saw some of that, during the pandemic with some of my programs that we couldn't do after school. We couldn't do primary mental health. But our staffing, our community-based organization, we're thinking outside the box, totally creating stuff. I mean, I see it all over the country. Secretary Cardona talked about it this morning, whether it's Texas, whether it's Kansas, whether it's Massachusetts, whether it's Oklahoma, creativity. And we just don't give enough, we don't give ourselves enough credit for it, because I guarantee you that if it doesn't work, if that recipe doesn't work, I'm going to just keep tweaking those ingredients or throw everything away and start from scratch or get something else to make it work.
Yep. And that's the beauty of critical race theory framework, Agnes, that you could use those tenets like the counter story, the interest convergence, if you think about it, to really think about that how, right? I say that because I don't forget one time I was at a school and the principal was so excited. We were doing a welcoming walkthrough and parents need to come, right? And there was a parent there with a child who was receiving SPED services, right? And he was in a wheelchair. And she was, before the parents came, she's like, you'll see, needs that everything even for SPED, it's gonna be fine. And I was like, okay. So then the parent goes out and then her comment was, I didn't realize that my child has never been in the first or second floor of the school because he's on a wheelchair. He only enters through here and gets out of there. And that parent, 30 minutes before she went on a walkthrough, she had very amazing things to say about her child. She learned that the policies were not working and that why is her child isolated? Was that intentional? But it was so hard for me to watch that interaction because the intention of the how, it was a great action. They wanted to make that child feel comfortable, but the parent was like, oh my gosh, my child is in the 4th grade and he's never been on the 2nd floor. But, so that's why, like Agnes, what you're saying brings me to that, because now they had an opportunity to go back to the table. That was a little bit longer solution to that. But it was an eye-opening because we think we have it all worked out, and then it suddenly just goes like, no, sorry. But it doesn't mean they're bad people. It doesn't mean that we don't keep trying.
Yes.
I just wanted to share, in addition to Nitza's conversation with us about some of the tenets of critical race theory. I dropped this in the chat box, which was just recently published, which is, you know, when you go into the top part, principles of the CRT, it makes the connections between CLS and CRT. But I feel that this is a really great idea, you know, some good tenets for you to share with your staff and around really what CRT is. And a lot of what Neetz has said, a lot of what Agnes and many of us have said in this space today, it's really centered around this framework and structure, about the importance of counterstory, you know, counterstory and the permanence of racism and some of the other tenets that Neetz has shared. So I encourage you to download this as well from the chat box to help support your conversations. Okay. Any other comments?
Yes, I have a question. So using the CRT frame makes sense, I think, in curriculum and instruction and the policies of a school and the development of a culture of a school. It makes perfect sense. My question is surrounding the messaging of this, and particularly in this environment, and right down the road from me is the hotspot, I think, of this anti-CRT movement in Greenwich. It's huge. They have a truck that they drive around the city with flashing LED signs. Yeah, it's an entire system. How is the best way to message this? Is the best way to say, listen, we are using a critical race theory framework, or is it to couch it in different language, but still move the work forward?
I think both for me.
Good question.
I think for me, both are correct. You have to be strategic on what it is that you want, right? You know, I have been getting a phone call from a grandparent. She's actually a grandparent. I think I don't think she's from Greenwich, but she's on that school. And, you know, this is her fourth time calling me. And the first time I said to her, I just need you to give us a chance. And I don't want you to blah, blah, blah. So we have been having this conversation. And last week she says to me, you know, I just wish there were more people like you and me that disagree, but still like each other. But I was able to explain to her X, Y, and Z related to curriculum. And I'm not going to tell you that we are not teaching CRT in that curriculum, but there are titles like United States Act of 1915 for Puerto Rico, who benefits? Who benefits is really interest convergence, right? Because it all depends who the audience is, and I have to be strategic what my message is. What am I trying to convey? Because if I see that fan and they're just not going to listen at that moment, then I'm going to use a different language and going to get to the same outcome. So for me, it all depends on what I'm trying to do. But it depends on what the readiness from both parties are. And that's what I noticed, is that there's so much hate that neither one of the sides are willing to listen to each other without giving each other a chance. So when I talk to her and I say to her, like, I just need you to listen to my side right now. You know, so I was talking to her and then I said to her, she said, well, did you say in there, she just asked me this question too, the melting pot, and that you say like that melting pot really and assimilation. And I said, first, do you understand what that means? So I explained the history about language suppression. And then I think it all depends on that, where you guys are, right? What they're willing to listen. And I said, let me ask you a personal question. What is your ethnic group? So she tells me, and I say, you see, this is what we need. I don't think it's fair that your parents have to give up their home language so that you can be so-called American. That is the message we're giving here, that it's okay. We're not saying it's less American or more American. We're saying it's okay. You should have been given that space. And she was like, yeah, I should have, but this was our fourth conversation, right? So it all depends. For me, that's what I believe, is you have to be really strategic and you have to know what it is that you want to say. And that's the issue. Sometimes we just go, we're not teaching it, we're teaching it, and we don't listen to each other.
I do think, and thank you, Neith and Brian, for sharing your questions, because that's, that question comes, Brian, your question comes to us a lot. I do think, we need to clarify a lot of misunderstandings. I think that there's many misunderstandings around what CRT is, and I think we have to clarify and really, be transparent about it, some of the real misunderstandings in a very strategic way, as Nitsa said.
And it doesn't help, like, and I said to myself, she's asking me about 1776 curriculum. I said, I'm just gonna go check it out. And I realized that it's so strategic, because and it actually has some good lessons. I cannot say that it doesn't, right? The people who wrote the lessons are people of color. So if you think about that, the ones that were posted on the website, the ones that they were highlighting, good or bad, I don't know. But the strategy works, right? Create more division, because neither one of you are listening to each other. So 1619 is all CRT, 1776 is not CRT, it's giving like kumbaya, this happened, but we all need to get along. And they say 1619 doesn't do that. They both do the same thing. It's who's telling the story. That's different. But why the strategy is like, well, we have the same, we have people of color here who wrote the lesson. So why are you not using 1776 and using 1619? So the strategy, like for me, I was like, well, that's a good lesson. We can talk about it. Doesn't say anything bad. But that's the strategy. So we have to be able to have that strategy in order but if they're not willing to listen, nothing's gonna work.
As many as we've heard today, this is hard work. This is complex work. This is critical work. And, to begin to engage in these critical conversations and read and, really even being able to make and engage in some critical interruptions about what's happening, about what may have been said, not just, even not just some of the community, but even some of our own staff members. We have to be able to, as leaders, make, have some critical conversations and ensure that we do some critical interruptions if we hear something happening or we see something happening. I know that we have like 2 minutes left. Are there any other final comments? It was great having you all in the space, but any thoughts about as you begin to open up this year, using some of the resources that we've shared with you, engaging in this conversation about this work? Any other thoughts? Even as you move forward, just using some of these, the beliefs, actions, the how, and we close with just some of these features, just to continue for you to share with your staff, as Miguel and all of our presenters today said, we're all in this work together. It takes a village to do this work. We're all warriors to take this work on. But I think this is some really important, some of the features to help us to make this happen. Okay, and I'm gonna drop this PowerPoint in the chat box.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Any other final thoughts? Thank you, Nitsa, for your background knowledge, which is incredible.
Thank you, Steve and Nitsa, for
Thank you.
masterfully creating a space for this very challenging conversation to be had and for your thoughtful and great ideas as to how do we move forward. Because at the end of the day, like you said, Steve, we are in this together. Thank you so much.
Okay.